Thanks for being here, everybody. This is our quarterly and then some Conservation Connector. I'm Cynthia Canner, Executive Director of Prairie State Conservation Coalition. And this is a series that we started last year, and we bring to you different topics that we hope are pertinent and interesting to you that will help you with your work or just pure education. And we're very excited to have this presentation with Kim Erndt-Pitcher. Kim is with Prairie Rivers Network. She's the director for Ecological Health. And so she's going to be talking with you all and then having a conversation afterwards about herbicide drift. And some of you may have heard her presentations before. She's been very involved with research for many years on the damages to oak trees and other vegetation around Illinois and beyond. And so some of you may be new to this, and we're excited as a conservation, land trust, and conservancy movement and coalition to bring in the perspective of how can we support Kim and her work, and what is it that is affecting your land where you might be. And we welcome everyone from around the state. Really happy you could be here. So Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you, and welcome to go ahead and share your screen with us.
I'm Kim Erndt-Pitcher. I'm Director of Ecological Health with Prairie Rivers Network. And for those of you that aren't familiar with PRN, we are a statewide conservation organization. Our mission is to protect water, heal land, and inspire change. We have a staff of around 50 personnel. We've been in existence for going on 58 years here in Illinois, and we have a really wide range of program areas, from helping communities transition to coal to renewable source of energy, water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, river health and restoration, invasive species, particularly involving aquatic invasive species, and also pesticide drift, which is what I'll be talking with you about today, in particular our herbicide drift program. So I'm just going to offer a little bit of background and overview. Like Cynthia said, some of you may have seen these presentations before, so some of it will be review, and then hopefully there'll be a little bit of new stuff as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about our monitoring program and 6 years of data collection, and also talk about what's happening at a national, state, and local levels on this issue. So for probably the past decade or so, there have been increased reports of trees and plants with symptoms that are indicative of off-target herbicide injury. And this comes from row crop growers to specialty crop growers and landowners and land managers that are noticing it on wild and cultivated plants. And on this slide, you see cupped curled soybeans. That's the classic growth regulator herbicide injury of just reduced size in those leaves, and they're puckered and they're curling. In the middle here, we have tomato plants, whether it's in your backyard garden or large-scale growers, we'll commonly see these twisted, deformed leaves of tomato plants, as well as peaches, apples, all kinds of specialty crops. And then here we have a sycamore. This is really bowl-shaped, severely cupped sycamore. And there's been a lot of reports of injuries to trees reported in recent years, and that those have been increasing as the years go on. So as a result of a lot of calls from people like you and others around the state, we designed the tree and plant health monitoring program. And this program is basically giving us an opportunity to observe and document and rate the symptoms of off-target herbicide injury around the state. It's essentially a rapid bioassessment of herbicide injury in a landscape. And we would not have this program without the hard work and dedication of Martin Kemper. He's a retired DNR biologist and PRN volunteer. For those of you that know, he is a wealth of information. He's dedicated to conserving biodiversity in our state and is just a powerhouse and has done a tremendous amount to manage our data and to collect data and to work with volunteers and even give talks like I am right now. Other PRM members have played a big role in this as well. Many of them have been out in the field with us monitoring. Loon Nelms, who's a member, he helped design our tissue analysis program as part of this monitoring and has always been a great help in editing our reports and things. So just to talk a little bit about our use of herbicides, we use them for a lot of things, and we use a lot of them. We use them in commercial and private turf care, as well as maintaining woody debris and broadleaf plants and utility rights of ways, as well as in conservation land management for invasive species control and habitat protection and restoration. And they're also widely used in agricultural systems. Herbicides are great tools. I am not anti-herbicide, but I think we need to use them wisely, and we need to be aware of their off-target impacts and negative impacts. So many of you may know, but herbicides are one type of pesticide. And so when we say pesticides, that's a general term for herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, and other types of pesticides. And in the United States, we use approximately 1 billion pounds a year of conventional pesticides. And we use a tremendous amount of herbicides in our country. In fact, one of the leading causes of herbicide pollution is agricultural use. And that is because approximately 75% of our land, or 27 million acres, are in row crop or in agricultural production. And the majority of that land is in row crop production and is planted in herbicide tolerant, mainly corn and soybeans. There are other crops, of course, but that takes up the majority of the row crop production in our state. And in these systems, we have a heavy reliance on herbicides for weed control. And it's not like this agricultural system that our grandparents or parents used, or maybe even we grew up in, where there was diversified cropping systems. We had cattle on the landscape. We maybe grew oats and pumpkins and 3 or 4 different crops in rotation. Now it's corn and soybean back to back. And a lot of the time during the winter and the off seasons, that ground is bare, and those winter annual weeds have time to thrive and grow. So as a result of changing the way that we farm and our over-reliance on herbicides, we now have this terrible problem of herbicide-resistant weeds. And just as some history here, in the 1990s, the way we farmed really changed because of the widespread adoption of glyphosate-resistant crops, Roundup-resistant crops. So whereas we would use these herbicides early in the season for, overwintering weed control prior to planting, these resistant crop technologies allowed us to use herbicides in the middle of the growing season, over the top of growing plants, killing the weeds and killing the crop. Fast forward to the 2020s, again, this is really high level, simple snapshot here of the background. We have even more crops with herbicide resistant traits, and some of them have multiple resistance. So we call them stacked. They're stacked with resistant traits to multiple types of herbicides. In addition to this, we're also using more volatile herbicides that we've kind of historically stopped using quite as much because they caused problems. And I'll talk about volatility here in a minute, but growth regulator herbicides that target the growing parts of plants like 2,4-D and dicamba, both widely used in agriculture as well as in turf control and turf management. We've started using them in agriculture in the middle of the growing season because we have resistant crops to those herbicides, and they are volatile. They have a tendency to move off site even days after they've been applied and move long distances where they can cause damage. And I'll explain that more later. But these graphs are from the U.S. Geological Survey, and I use these a lot because I think that they're a really great way to visualize how the use of some herbicides has changed throughout the years. And this is the 5 main herbicides that we find in our tissue analysis. And these graphs are showing the trends, the lowest estimated use of their trends by crop and year. And if you look in the upper left at dicamba, you can see on around 2017, the use in dicamba skyrocketed. And that is when we got dicamba-resistant soybeans and cotton on the landscape. Additionally, down here, if you look at glyphosate in the bottom center, you can see when in the 1990s, when we got herbicide-resistant crops resistant to glyphosate, the use of glyphosate skyrocketed. And so that is, not only more growers using those herbicides, but they're being used, throughout the growing season. We've always used a lot of atrazine. It's a really popular herbicide for corn. 2,4-D, you can see that the use of 2,4-D has increased in recent years. That's partially because of herbicide-resistant traits in crops, but it's also because we are trying to combat those herbicide-resistant weeds. And glufosinate, the same story. So here's 2 little videos that we had made that kind of illustrate what happens. And when I talk about herbicide drift, I'm usually talking about either particle drift or vapor drift. And that's the 2 main ways that herbicides can move through the air. And I'll get my little video going here. So particle drift happens at the time of application. It's when the wind carries the particles of a pesticide off-site, where they can land, in this case, herbicides, on non-target areas and cause injury. And then we also have vapor drift. Oops, sorry. Vapor drift can occur when an applicator is not applying in high winds and is following the law according to the letter, or according to the label. But vapor drift occurs when the herbicide essentially evaporates, turns into a vapor, sometimes days after they've been applied, moves off-site and can move for miles, and then lands on non-target plants, causing injury, and sometimes widespread injury at a landscape level. So what are the symptoms of herbicide exposure, and what impacts the expression and the severity of these symptoms that we're going to look at? Well, first of all, it's the rate of exposure. How much herbicide landed on that plant, on those leaves? Also, what type of herbicide was being used and drifted upon, or what combination of herbicides was being used? Also, different species we've seen have different sensitivities to herbicide exposure and to different classes of herbicide. Individual plant health can also play a big role. So, if I get sick with a cold or exposed to a cold, I might just have the sniffles or sneeze a little bit. But my son might be down for a week with a stuffy head and achy bones, and he might be much more impacted by that exposure. And it's the same with plants and herbicide exposure. Individual plant health plays a role as well. And then also growth stage of the plant is particularly important, especially when we're looking at drift from growth regulator herbicides. If it's flowering, if the buds are swelling, if those leaves are unfurling, it's a really sensitive time for those plants to be exposed to herbicides. Ecologically, we know that there are numerous impacts. We have a tremendous amount of questions, but we do know from the literature that, particularly with growth regulator herbicides, when plants are exposed to them, they have reduced forage quality. So there's lower nutrition in that leaf material. They also produce fewer flowers, and those flowers tend to be visited by pollinators less frequently. And so this is a problem because it can lead to a loss in function in our plant pollinator networks. And that, of course, impacts fruit and nut and seed production as well. And this can also lead to changes in behavior, changes in nesting habitat, choices of what animals are gonna consume, whether it's an insect, a bird, or a small mammal, and the quality of that food. And when animals have to change their behavior and sometimes travel longer distances to obtain food resources or habitat resources, that can put them at risk for stress and predation. So from our data, we know that exposures are occurring multiple times a year and in many locations, multiple years in a row. These chronic and repeated exposures are stressing trees and other plants and diminishing health. And again, I said just a minute ago that these exposed plants can produce fewer flowers, they're pollinated less frequently, and they can have lower nutritional content, leading to these declines and resources for other wildlife. And we're seeing these declines on a landscape scale with declines in forest health. So before we start looking at symptoms, I, have been asked to show people what a normal leaf looks like. And I think that this is a really important thing to do because some of us have been seeing injury for a long time. And we don't always realize if you're not aware of what injury looks like, you don't know you're seeing it. But once you see it, you realize how widespread it is. And so I think it's a great practice to look at healthy leaves versus injured leaves. I myself, I was probably looking at injury before I, started working on this project and never knew it. I'm sure it's been happening on our property years before I started documenting it. On the right, we have a healthy red bud leaf. It's nice, it's heart-shaped, it's bright green, it's soft. And on the left, we have an injured leaf. These leaves are cupped, they're curled, their margins are wavy and uneven, and these leaves are going to feel thicker. Below that, on the right, we have an injured sugar maple. This leaf is severely injured. It's curling, it's cupping. It has those irregular margins. The leaf points, the tips are elongated. It's also chlorotic or yellowing in appearance, which is something we see quite frequently. Here we have grape, a nice, beautiful, flat grape leaf that's healthy. And on the right, we have an injured grape leaf. Grapes tend to be fairly sensitive, particularly to growth regulator herbicides. These leaves are stunted. Again, they have the irregular margins, and they also are a little chlorotic or yellowing. Below us, we have, below this, we have a healthy post oak leaf. These leaves are bright green. They have nice normal shaped lobes, a nice soft texture to that leaf. On the right, we have post oak leaves that are clearly deformed. This is curling and cupping. These leaves are stunted, which indicates that it perhaps was exposed to herbicide drift when these leaves were unfurling or the buds were swelling. You'll also notice that these leaves are twisting at the petiole, and that we call that epinasty. And, that's a big deal because these leaves are not oriented to the sun the way that they normally would be. And also, I'm pretty convinced that their ability to shed rainfall is hindered quite a bit too. Let's take a little tour around the state. This is Washington County State Recreation Area. It's an Illinois Natural Areas Inventory site. And this red oak, it's clearly cupped. The leaf is puckered, and I would guess to say that these leaves are also going to be thickened. That's typically what we see, especially in the oaks, is when they're curled and cupped, their leaf material, especially when they're stunted in growth, is extremely thick and tough. Which, makes us wonder, what does this mean for the hundreds of species of Lepidoptera that require oaks for host plants for their, larval caterpillars? And, they have to eat these leaves. And ecologically, what does that mean for them? So it's important to mention that when we go to a site to monitor, we are not just looking at one species or one tree. We're looking at multiple layers within an area. So the ground layer, whether it's a prairie or a forest floor, we're looking for symptoms in those plants as well as the understory. So you have your red buds, your dogwoods, your buttonbush, those types of plants. And then your canopy trees, like your mature oaks, sweet gums, maples, etc. So when we notice symptoms in multiple species across a large area, that's indicative to us of herbicide injury. It helps us rule out plants, pathogens. It helps us rule out insect or other stressors. So, the tissue analysis that I'll talk to shortly, it really helps us identify those pesticides that are causing the injury, but it's the symptoms that we discover in the monitoring that helps us identify that there was injury at a location. Here we have Noble Woods Nature Preserve. Again, this is a white oak, another oak. These locations that I'm showing you are all locations that we monitor year after year, and these trees have experienced injury for multiple years in a row now. Here, Jackson County, this is a prairie, this is compass plant. All the compass plants in this prairie looked like this, and you can see there's plants in the background. There's wingstem and some goldenrod and some ironweed, and I think some culver's root and some sunflowers in there as well. And they all are showing varying degrees of symptoms, varying severity. So, different species, again, are going to be more sensitive. And our experience, the silphiums tend to be particularly sensitive to growth regulators. And I'll show you some more examples in a moment. Here we have Marissa Woods, another long-term monitoring site, and this is the post oak. And this tree is under extreme stress. Not only can we tell from a distance that these leaves are cupped and curled, but this canopy is just not healthy. There is been some branch dieback. There's big holes in this canopy, and these leaves have started to bunch, or what we call pom-pom, on the ends of these branches. And this tree is really struggling to produce healthy leaves to photosynthesize and make the food that it needs to survive. Here we have rosinweed, another silphium. This picture was taken on a 40-acre prairie and organic farm in McLean County, and there were hundreds, if not several thousand, of these rosinweed plants that were injured, as well as other plants in the prairie showing injury. But this classic twisting, curling, and stunting of the leaves. And then you also have that yellowing, that chlorosis again. Heading back down south and towards the eastern part of the state, we have Beetles Barrens Nature Preserve. Beautiful place, magical place, but it is struggling from herbicide injury. And this is a post oak, clearly cupped, curled leaves. And it's hard to tell, but this is actually the second leaf out. Sometimes if these trees get hit with herbicide injury early in the season, they'll have severe stunting in those leaves, and then later in the season they will expend more energy to produce a second round of leaves, and the second round of leaves has symptoms of injury as well. Unfortunately, this is a site where we're seeing a significant amount of decline in white oaks and decline in the health of post oaks. So the owners are very concerned about this issue and really doing everything they can to help make a difference when it comes to herbicide drift trespassing on their property. So our tissue analysis program, again, is really critical in helping us understand what herbicides are causing the symptoms that we're seeing, but they're not our sole way of identifying or diagnosing herbicide injury. That is based on the symptomology that we're seeing. Basically, how we collect samples is we, use gloves and sterile cleaning equipment, and we collect a gallon Ziploc bag of leaves, and we put them directly in a cooler or in a freezer if we are waiting to ship a bunch of samples at one time. We send this bag of leaves off to a laboratory in South Dakota, and typically we like to have them analyzed for 3 screens of herbicides. So we look at the pre-emergent herbicides like atrazine and metolachlor. We look at the growth regulator herbicides. There's a whole suite, but it includes 2,4-D and dicamba. And we also look at glyphosate and glufosinate. So we're trying to get those big 5 that I showed you earlier, because they are really widely used in corn and soybean rotations. In most cases, and probably 99% of the cases, unless a landowner has called us because they've specifically gotten drifted on, we do not know when an event occurred. We're just collecting samples from a symptomatic plant. There are numerous things that can impact the presence or absence of herbicides in tissues. And this is really important because, we don't know when that drift event occurred. And we don't know exactly how quickly certain plants metabolize herbicides. We don't even know the rate that they were exposed to, how much of that herbicide landed on those leaves. And then weather can play a huge factor. So, rain events, humidity, hot, dry, it all plays a factor in how long we might be able to detect these herbicides in these tissues. This is important to recognize because if we run 3 screens on one bag of leaves, whether we are doing a bag of leaves from one tree, one post oak, or whether I'm sampling 3 post oaks and putting all those leaves into one bag at one site, so that would be a composite sample, it's going to cost me $950 for that one sample to have it analyzed. So it's really cost prohibitive to do a lot of samples, but extremely valuable information can come from it. And this is this creature is the state Champaign post oak. It's in Washington County. This is a tree that we have been watching for many years. It's in a large pasture. We've been monitoring the trees in this pasture since 2017, and we have collected approximately 17 tissue samples from this tree over the years, and we try to space them out anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, more about 4 weeks apart from each other. And based on the analysis results and the levels of herbicides present in the results, as well as when a new pesticide or herbicide would pop up in the results, we've determined that this tree has received at least 15 separate exposures to drift in the past several years. And I say at least because other researchers that are looking at this issue around the state, like the Illinois Natural History Survey, they have used different labs and run their analysis on leaf samples where they're looking at more than 100 different pesticides. So not just herbicides and not just the 3 classes we're looking at, but more classes of herbicides and more pesticides. So they're also testing for fungicides and insecticides, and they have found detections of other types of pesticides in their results. So, that indicates that these trees are under stress multiple times throughout the growing season in many places. This is one of the neighbors to this post oak. I believe this tree is gone now. The landowners have had to take it down. This photo was taken a couple years ago. It's got severe epicormic branching. It's really putting all of its energy into putting leaves out on those main branches. It's kind of its last ditch effort to photosynthesize and to make food. You can also see a lot of dead branches in this tree. It's experiencing a lot of dieback. The landowners of this property have really been dedicated to protecting these trees and being stewards of the land, but they have had to remove quite a few trees over the years. So in a glance here, from 6 years of monitoring, we've documented symptoms in 99 species of trees, 48 species of shrubs and woody vines, 115 species of herbaceous plants, like this injured cup plant here on the right. And this is from 737 visits to both rural and urban locations. So we're not just doing nature preserves, we're also doing people's backyards, neighborhoods, community parks, cemeteries, etc. Again, hats off to Marty Kemper for all of his hard work and dedication and monitoring and helping manage this database. So just in summary, the severity of the symptoms and the species with visible symptoms may vary within years and across years at each site. So some sites may be more severely impacted one year than the next. But one of the consistent things is that most of these locations, to some degree, have a level of injury year after year. And many of them are experiencing exposures multiple times a year. And we are seeing declines in several species, especially species of oaks. So what is happening on this issue around the nation and the state and locally? Well, nationally, Prairie Rivers and our partners are in pretty regular meetings with US EPA and the Washington office, as well as Region 5. We're also actively commenting on the registration of pesticides or their label changes and reviewing them and submitting comment letters to US EPA. We're also working with multiple states, and I meant to put them in here, but North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, Indiana, and Ohio. We're all working together on this issue. I think Illinois is way ahead of the game in terms of understanding the issue and taking some action on it. But it is an issue that is not just in Illinois. It is impacting forested lands and natural areas around the country. We're also actively working with Xerces and the Society for Invertebrate Conservation, Audubon, Pesticide Action Network, the Environmental Working Group, and the Center for Biological Diversity. This group, along with PRN, meets quarterly to talk about things and strategize, and much more frequently when we have group comment letters or labels to review or meetings with agencies to come up. At a state level, for several years, Prairie Rivers and our partners have been putting forth legislation to try to help make some progress in this way. Now, the legislation certainly is not the only solution here. I always say that this problem is extremely complex and it's going to take a lot of people working together from a lot of different angles to solve it. But legislation certainly is one way that we can take steps in the right direction and at least sort of slow down the level of injury that we've been seeing, the level of decline that we're witnessing. We're also working closely with the Department of Natural Resources, the Nature Preserves Commission, and the Natural History Survey and other NGOs. IDNR, INPC, and the Natural History Survey have all been monitoring the lands that they manage and valuable natural areas around the state. INPC and DNR and the History Survey have all also collected tissue samples, and their findings are very similar to ours. In fact, PRN collaborated and took many of the ones on the DNR and INPC sites. We collected those samples. In hopefully a couple weeks, we will be releasing our 6-year report summarizing 6 years of monitoring. We're also trying to raise awareness. We did a huge installation in Champaign, Urbana at Carl Park during the Boneyard Arts Festival, where we tied over 300 trees with ribbons to symbolize, what herbicide damage can do if it impacts, your local park. And we did collect tissue samples and had them analyzed from that park this past summer, and they came back with multiple herbicides present. So we utilize our our findings to build awareness in communities and try to create more stewardship in those areas. We're also increasing our monitoring and our tissue sampling and adding in water testing this year as well. So that's all great, but what can you do? First of all, if you're not already seeing it, which I'm assuming many of you are because you're here, look at the trees and other plants when you're out, whether it's the land that you manage or love or, in your community, and talk with neighbors, local decision makers, landowners, land managers about this issue, because most people are not aware of it. We take for granted, trees and plants, and we often don't question funny looking leaves. And the more people that are aware, the better off we're all going to be in trying to make this situation go away. And also, in residential areas or urban areas, ask local schools, park districts, public works departments to reduce or completely even eliminate the use of herbicides for weed control. Agriculture is a big contributor to this issue, but turf management and private lawn management also injures trees and plants, and it can also drift and move off site. So communicating with communities is not only valuable in terms of, the education aspect, but also ensuring that we have healthy trees in our communities and we don't have to, cut down trees in our city parks because we're injuring them ourselves. And most importantly, probably, and also at times the most frustrating part is reporting this injury to the Department of Agriculture. This is hugely important. When you see injury, please report it. There's a link to the Department of Agriculture's pesticide misuse complaint form. It is frustrating because a lot of times you're going to file a complaint, you're going to have a visit, and there might not be any resolution to the injury that you've received. But this information goes from the state of Illinois to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And those numbers of complaints that they receive are really, really important. We also have a link to this form on our website. And finally, we have formed the Save Our Trees Coalition for Herbicide Accountability. And that is a group of interested landowners, people that have been dealing with this issue for many, many years. And many of the people that I mentioned in this talk today are also part of that coalition. And we're working together with other NGOs and trying to form policies and education materials and strategies that will help stop herbicide drift from harming our trees and plants. So stay tuned, and you'll hear more in 2025 from PSEC or from Prairie Rivers or other partners like the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission on what legislation we're going to be trying to put forward again this year and coming up in 2025. And with that, I will take any questions.
Kim, thank you so much. But does anybody want to lead us off with questions for Kim? We have a good 20 minutes. You can raise your hand or just come off mute. There you go, Ken.
Are there, have we seen, is there a buffer area that would be helpful? I mean, it sounds like it's miles, so it's unpractical, I imagine.
Yeah, so that's a really great question because there's a lot going on in this problem, right? So we have the particle drift, which tends to happen when there's a misuse or a grower is applying in high winds, right? So a buffer, while that is an enforceable, law, if it's not obeyed, we're not going to be protected from it. When it comes to vapor drift, no, I mean, these volatile herbicides, they're going to move when we get, the right weather conditions, they're going to move.
I'm with the Northwest Illinois Forestry Association and several park foundations. And in this part of the state, I see it all over. I get questions about it frequently. My forester has talked about it on my property at some of our events, impacting the oak tree on my property. And it just seems like there's not a whole lot that can be done. Has anyone been going after the producers? I mean, a year or two ago, they started having posters out that the farmers were putting up. I have a right to spray and things like that. I saw those from Pioneer, I believe it was. And are we trying to counter some of that kind of thing?
Yeah. So we at Prairie Rivers, we're working really hard to kind of counter that narrative. And it is not easily done. You know, there's a tremendous PR machine behind the
Yeah.
agricultural industry, and they're very, very good at crafting that narrative. Um, you know, we have started using the term herbicide trespass because it illustrates the fact that this is something that someone else is doing and it's trespassing and causing injury on my property. It's impacting my rights to clean air, to a healthy vegetable garden, to having, you know, an oak tree live 200 years old. So we are trying to do that. It's going to take more than just PRN doing that. It's going to have to take other groups in the conservation community using this narrative as well. And it can be at times, you know, pretty controversial.
Yeah. In Illinois, I mean, the big group is the Farm Bureau and trying to get them engaged in understanding. Have we done presentations to the Farm Bureau, or
They are
it's not
very
even open?
They are very aware of us.
Okay.
We have not been invited to present to them, but they are there. They are watching
Uh,
and have been for many years, and not big fans of some of the work that our
it's
coalition is
it's
doing.
interesting. Several farmers have talked with me as well about the impacts that they're seeing to the vegetable gardens and grapevines and so forth that they've had historically, and they're seeing impact themselves on
Yeah.
their own vegetable gardens and so forth. So yeah, it's
Yeah, I and just real quick, because I know we got other questions to take. I down in Southern Illinois, I'm surrounded by the Shawnee, and I'm also surrounded by orchards. And some of the orchards here are so heavily impacted that they're taking out hundreds or thousands of trees. And it's really putting a dent in their bottom line. And it's very sad to see.
Let's go to Paul and then Gary.
Thanks, Kim. First of all, I've got a couple of questions and maybe one comment, if I might. I worked with Marty for years within the DNR, and a very good friend of Lou's, and kind of been following this for a while. My first question is, has any other tissue besides sort of the leaves been looked at? And my thought is here that with this repeated exposure and the leaves and the trees metabolizing these herbicides, is it showing up in other parts of the plant and maybe causing injury there? Especially for trees, I'm thinking maybe even in the roots and the growing parts of the roots. I know that would be a very hard sample to take, but it seems like it might be worth looking at.
Mhm.
The second question I have is, has there been any indication that this injury sort of causes a cascading effect of making the tree more susceptible to other pathology? You know, some diseases like wilts and fungal diseases that trees may get. It seems like this weakening of the tree would be much like it would be for one of us. If we have one problem, it seems like it might be causing susceptibility to other problems. And I don't know if there's been any indication. Probably a very hard thing to research, but it's a question that I have. And finally, for my comment is that these producers, and this kind of speaking to what Ken said, these producers, a lot of times the producers aren't doing the spraying themselves. It's almost all these custom applicators. And I think maybe even more so than the Farm Bureau, I think the big companies And I think that's the PR machine you were talking about, Kim. They really, really don't want to have to deal with this. And I think I'm seeing guys actually cutting trees down because they don't want injury showing up where people can monitor it. I know that sounds a little crazy, but I think it's almost happening. I'm seeing a lot of fence rows and stuff going down that, that's always been going on, but it seems like it's really been accelerated recently. And the other thing is these farmers have cover. If everybody's spraying it all at kind of the same time, and all these big, Nutrient or Growmark or whatever companies doing the custom spraying, if they're all out here doing it at once, it's really hard to pin a incidence to any one producer. So it's really hard to hold anyone responsible for all this that's going on. It's just a really tough thing to do. Thank you very much, Kim. I appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. And you brought up some great points and things I actually intended to cover in the talk, but sometimes we get on a roll and we don't touch on everything we want to. In terms of what's happening in other parts of the plant, we have not. That is something that we always talk about, even with our colleagues and partners in other states, is, these are systemic pesticides in many cases. So what does that mean for root production? What does that mean for nutrient transport in these trees, and, the xylem and the phloem, and even in these perennial plants? Is there carryover, or is the stress that they receive from injury one year going to keep them from flowering the next? There's so many questions. One of the things that we have been trying to get into place, and it's going to take some dedicated funding, is really looking at some of these sites where we've been doing long-term monitoring and doing some dendrology, some coring of some of these trees, to just see if there's any indication of changes in the actual growth of some of these trees from that we know have been hit year after year, and even multiple times a year. And in terms of your question about, are these trees getting more susceptible to other diseases? That is a hard one to answer. I mean, we know that this injury is happening with the background of invasive species, of drought, of flood, of fire suppression, of pathogens, of, fungal diseases, and it's additive to that. And just like when I'm under stress and I get exposed to one more stressor or a virus, I'm going to be more susceptible to that. And while we do not have a lot of data indicating that herbicide drift is making them more susceptible to galls or to oak wilt or whatever, we are seeing decline in the health of these trees, and significant, just visual, very in-your-face symptoms of stress, that epicormic branching or that pom-pomming effect, and the second leaf outs. Those things really stress these trees, and they're going to make them more susceptible, undoubtedly, to other diseases.
So, Kim, so as far as like gathering some what looks like evidence or being part of this, solution around the state for our conservation organizations, is there, going to the website that you suggested, is that the best way for all of us as conservation organizations and conservation minded people to simply report there? Or is there something where people should connect directly with you and set up times for you to go visit these suspected areas?
Yeah, so what I think we should do at this point is, we're in the process of revamping our website. People can certainly go to get information. We have multiple reports available there, and some videos and some education materials, including a database of healthy versus injured leaves that they can look at. But if they want to have someone take a look at their property, feel free to reach out to me. If I personally cannot come out, then one of our volunteers, perhaps can, or I can connect you with someone else that is well-versed in this issue and can help you monitor and, walk you through. Because there are, agency personnel that are deeply concerned about this, particularly a lot of our heritage biologists up there. I'm not volunteering them for work, but I might be able to connect them to you.
Thank you. And Gary, did I miss you, or is your hand still up?
My hand is up.
Go, Gary.
Okay. Here, maybe I can better put it down first. Anyway, I'm with a nonprofit organization, and we have a 3,000 acre refuge in north central Illinois. And on it, there is a nature preserve. And working with the Nature Preserve Commission, we've identified a lot of oak or damage to our oaks from herbicide drift, both in the preserve and elsewhere on the refuge, to a large number of different species that grow there. So I'm concerned, like everybody else, is, like, what do you do? And it's really hard not to get really upset. We don't know where it's coming from. There's ag surrounding us almost in every single direction. But you've kind of covered all that. So my question is actually in regard to people that work in these areas. You get these volatile herbicides around, and they're breathing this stuff. And to what extent should we be concerned about people being exposed themselves? And are there any, is there any information about, what kinds of impacts that might have?
That is a great question, and it's one that we get all of the time. As part of our coalition work, we're trying to bring in physicians and toxicologists into the mix that can, formally speak to this issue. But, yeah, we are all breathing the same air that our trees are exposed to and creating for us. And there is literature, on, of course, the data safety sheets associated with all these herbicides. But the problem with that is, we don't know the rates that are in the air. We don't know the combinations of the pesticides that are in the air. We also have very, very little information on the toxicity of some of the adjuvants or the additives of the inert, non-active ingredients in a lot of these pesticides. So our information is extremely limited in terms of what we've been experiencing in the past 8 to 10 years on the landscape in terms of herbicide use and herbicide drift, and what our exposure is and what that means for our health. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that, but it is definitely something that we need to become better versed in. We need more information on, and I think is going to be one of the biggest aspects of dealing with this issue across the landscape, is coming at it from a human health aspect, not just, an ecological or a climatic aspect.
Yeah, and I can't help but feel that this is maybe a way to get in the door in terms of either legislation or regulation, because a lot of people aren't, quite frankly, just going to care about, some trees and that kind of thing, but they might care about their children being exposed and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and we did do some tissue sampling and featured in our report coming up it's a preschool here, nature-based preschool that's actually housed on a nature preserve in the Champaign-Urbana area. And those children every summer have to be run indoors by their teachers because they can feel the drift and they can smell the drift while they're outside playing. So as our communities expand and sprawl and there's more interface with the urban and rural areas, it's going to become more and more of a problem, and more people are going to be asking the same questions.
Paul, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I've actually got a question. Kim, as far as I know, there's absolutely no way of knowing what these guys are spraying out there. You can kind of guess if you know something about ag, and And maybe if you've been around long enough, you can detect the odor of some of these things, but a lot of them are pretty odorless. And you might guess what they're spraying, but like you said, a lot of these adjuvants and a lot of these things are tank mixes where if they're using stacked trait GMOs, they're probably using stacked herbicides. So as far as I know, there's no like local record keeping of what these guys are putting down on these acres. I've seen big figures for like statewide estimates of what herbicides are going down, but there's really no way for the public to know what is being sprayed as far as I know. Yeah, and the other thing that I was going to say is these synergistic effects of all these tank mixes and how these things interact with other herbicides, other pesticides, you know, like what does this fungicide do with this herbicide together when they get together in the water? And, you know, that's, I'm glad you guys are going to start monitoring water because aquatic insects are a big deal. And that's, you know, something another thing we're blind to. It's out of sight, out of mind, and things that go on underwater, we just don't pay much attention to. So thanks again, Kim.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Great comments.
I think one thing that humans need to remember is we rely on trees for oxygen on our planet. You know, so that disconnect is just amazing to me. Like we have to go back to, you know, Ecology 101 or something to remind people, or reread Silent Spring. So Ken, did you have?
I just was wondering, Kim, do you have a presentation that could be shared so that all of us can take it back to our organizations and we can get more people aware and helping others identify when there's been impacts?
So one that is specifically geared towards identifying symptoms and recognizing them?
Yep.
Yeah, I do have one. It was created a couple years ago, but the symptoms haven't changed. Let me take a look at it, Ken, and see how up to date it feels. And if not, that would certainly be something worthwhile of recreating.
I'll shoot you an email so that you have my email. And yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. Great follow-up. And this presentation will be on, thanks to Sandy, who's with PSCC as well, will be on our YouTube channel. And so you can then go there and share out that link with everybody, you know.
Now, spreading the word is important on this topic. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions.
Kim, thank you. It's great to see you. And I had the honor of visiting with Kim down in Southern Illinois, and not so much an honor when she took me on the tour to see, you know, the cupped leaves, and it's staggering. It's just staggering. So I really encourage everyone on this call to all hands on deck. I mean, this is hugely important for our biodiversity, all the fallout from, you know, what our trees are suffering, and that domino effect on other species and things that we don't even know or see yet. So thank you so much, Kim. And I really appreciate everyone coming onto this program today. And we look forward to seeing you next time on our next Conservation Connector.